Welcome to Around the Writer's Table, a podcast focusing on the crossroads of creativity, craft, and conscious living for writers of all ages and backgrounds. Your hosts are Gina, Melody, and Kimbu, three close friends and women of a certain age who bring to the table their eclectic backgrounds and unique perspectives on the trials, tribulations, and the joys of writing. So pull up a chair and get comfortable here around the writer's table.
Hi, listeners. This is Gina Hogan Edwards coming to you on Around the Writer's Table. Welcome back to us. As you can see here, I am here with a guest today. Usually you will hear from me and from Kimbu York and Melody Scout, my co-hosts, but this is one of our interview sessions. And so our special guest today is Jennifer Schomberg Kanke, and she has I have been fortunate enough to meet her through Kimbu and got to hear her do a reading this past week. And we're really delighted to have you here today, Jennifer.
Thank you, Gina. I'm very excited to be here with you.
So let me give our audience a little bit of a formal introduction. After spending most of her life in Ohio, Jennifer now lives in Florida, which is where I live, and that is where she edits confidential documents. That sounds kind of exciting and very mysterious. Jennifer's work has recently appeared in New Ohio Review, Pleiades, Massachusetts Review, and Shenandoah. She's a winner of the Sheila Nagig Editor's Choice Award for Fiction, and her zine about her experiences undergoing chemotherapy for ovarian cancer, which is called Fine Considering, is available from Rinky Dink Press. Her full-length poetry collection, which I got to hear her read from this past week, is called The Swellest Wife Anyone Ever Had. It's about Appalachian, Ohio, and about her grandmother, and it's available now from Kelsey Books. Jennifer can be found on YouTube on the Meter and Mayhem channel, hosting the Meter Cute Interviews podcast, focusing on interviews with contemporary writers. Welcome, Jennifer. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Gina. It's wonderful to be here with you.
I'm going to be the first to tell you that I am not a poet. I love to hear the author read poetry like you did this past week when we were at our local bookstore, Midtown Reader. And so I'm not going to be able to ask you like lots of, academic poetry type questions, but that brought me to a question that I always love to ask authors who write in multi-genres, which you do. You're not only a poet. How do you identify yourself primarily? Do you consider yourself a poet or just a writer or what?
That's a good question. I think it depends on the context. If I'm doing something that involves my poetry, I'll identify as a poet, but if I'm doing something that's fiction, I'll just say I'm a writer. Um yeah, I kind of go back and forth between them. I think my academic degrees and things are all in poetry, so I think primarily I'm probably should be just saying I'm a poet, but because I do the other genres, I mix it up a little.
So tell me a little bit about what draws you to the kinds of things that you write about, whether it's poetry or fiction. What typically is the tug?
I think as cheesy as it sounds, and as sort of internet meme like, I think what often draws me is that I write about the things that I wish I would have been able to read when I was younger, or things that I want to read now. So I typically will write about my short stories, especially if I write a story where there's not a 10-year-old working class girl in the story. That's how you'll know it's not that it's like somebody imitating me or something. It's not really me because I always almost every story there's a 10-year-old girl, usually working class. Um there's a couple. I've got some stories based on like my father's life, and so I've got some that don't fit into that, but typically that's what I'm writing about. So wanting to get wanting to get stories that are often overlooked and
Mm.
just wanting to get them into literature. Especially like if you think about the my collection that just came out, I'm writing about an Appalachian woman in like really mainly the 1930s to around the 1960s is what's in the book. And you really don't hear too much about women during that time period and from that area in literature, and especially not in formal poetry. So that's kind of what draws me to it, I think, is things that I feel need a little bit more attention.
I can really see why Kimbu introduced us because there are a lot of things that we have in common. So the novel that I'm working on has a 9-year-old young girl in it. Um, we both are from Appalachia, different ends, but we're both from Appalachia. And sense of place, I have felt from the things that I've heard you read, um, that sense of place is really important in your work as well. You write about the flood in Ohio, and some other things that we're going to be talking about here. Um, but I'm curious, since we sort of share that little bit of um, those roots in Appalachia, identity as a theme in your writing, a theme in various works. How has your work been influenced by your family history and your Appalachian roots?
Um, so my brain goes off in like three different ways, and if I don't like address what it wants, then I'll never get to the other ones. So
Go
I want to
for
say
it.
also that um that my people are actually from the same area originally. Well, originally really, like they're from North Carolina before they moved to Ohio. There's parts of
Ah,
my family that are from the Asheville area in North Carolina. So we could be like cousins way back or something
uh-huh.
like that.
Yes. So to give some clarification for our listeners who may not know, I grew up in the Western North Carolina area, and Jennifer, you grew up in, is it Scioto County, Ohio?
So I grew up in Ohio, but my family is from Scioto County. Or I grew up in Columbus, but my family is from Scioto County. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Great. So back to the question.
Now that my brain has got allowed itself to say that, now
Yeah. Yeah.
to I think that my family, and I think this is true for a lot of Appalachian families, there was a really um strong roots in oral storytelling and in singing and folk music and that kind of stuff. And so I grew up around those rhythms and valuing and like the value of hearing poetry out loud. My grandfather, who I never knew, so I'm only getting this kind of through stories, he would recite poems. Apparently, Whittier was one of his favorites and also Longfellow. And so he would just like break in to a Longfellow poem, right? Like he would do the introduction to Evangeline. And he had a fifth grade education and dropped out of school at 14, but he had all those poems inside of him. And he also played banjo, and there were people in my family who played fiddle and dulcimer. And so those rhythms too from the folk music, I think they all find their way into my poetry and have shaped my identity and my interaction with language.
Mm, I love that. So I'm probably getting a little ahead of myself in some of the things that we talked about that we were going to talk about. But I'm really interested in, I was thinking as you were talking about how my dad claims that he has trouble reading poetry, that he never understands it. And I can't wait to take him your newest book, The Swellest Wife Anyone Ever Had, because one of the things that I love about it is how through the poems you tell a story. You know, it's It's these discrete individual entries, some longer than others, some quite short. But if you look at it as a whole, it tells this beautiful story. And I know that, history is important to you, which is also one of my interests. Um, and I'm curious about, as you go about the process of writing, how you weave in and incorporate that idea of history along with family identity and um, the poetic word from an academic aspect, like just weaving in the history and the family. And tell me a little more about that. How do you balance your research and your writing?
Um, I have no idea. I thought about this question, right? Like I have thought about this. Um, and I do whatever feels right. Um, whatever and sometimes I'll be writing and I'll get to a place where I'm like, "Oh, I need a detail here." Like, there's a poem called Confluence, which if it's okay, I would you mind if I read that poem and then I can show you kind of where I did a little bit of research,
Absolutely.
um,
I love that.
where I hit a is it okay if it's a little bit risque?
Yes.
Okay. So this is Confluence, 1933. Afternoon heat with mosquitoes in every small shady spot. She and Deet headed to swim where the creek meets the Little Scioto, down by Bob White Holler and out past old Wheeler's mill house. Modest black swimsuits with no frills to speak of, they'd worked long and hard for the store-bought contraptions, with worsted wool and a mermaid stamp tag. Such an extravagance. Weren't they so fancy? Didn't their calluses spark to the chill of the water as they giggled and splashed in their secret world with the warblers and wrens, their sweet stalwart companions and guardians? But up around a subtle bend, those hot, ornery boys, they were hopping in, and would you believe were just naked as jays, all dingles and dangles with muscles ripe from the hogs and the hay. They would swear later on that they had no idea that the girls were right there, just funning and sunning a lark and a dare, not meaning to make a show of themselves, not meaning to scare the birds all away.
Love
And
it.
thank
Right there with them.
you. Yeah. So with that poem, it has its core in a story that my granny told me about how she and her sister were swimming and a bunch of boys came floating down completely naked and they were like, "Oh, we didn't know you all were there." Um and one of those boys actually ends up being my grandfather. So anytime there's a young boy doing something he probably shouldn't be doing, that is most likely my grandfather. um and so when I sat down to write the poem, I go through a process known as enrhythming that I learned from Annie Finch, which is where you take a poem that's in a meter that you want to write in. So um, say you want to write in iambic pentameter, you could pull up a Shakespeare sonnet and you read that poem that's in the meter you want to eventually write in. You read that over and over again. And the goal is that your brain will kind of latch on to that rhythm. And so then when you go to write right after, you've kind of got it already in your heart and soul and mind, and it just kind of pours out.
Wow.
Um, and it's actually, I think technically, I think the actual linguistic term for it, I think it falls under semantic priming. Um, but in the poetry world, we call it enrhythming because it sounds cooler. Um,
Does sound cool.
and and so I enrhythmed and then just started trying to write Granny's story out.
Mm.
And I came to a place where I was like, I want to write about her swimsuit. But Granny passed away in 2006, and all of her brothers and sisters have also passed. There's nobody who was there who I can ask, hey, what did the swimsuits look like? So that's where the research part comes in, that I can look up and see, okay, we're in 1933, we're in Ohio, show me some swimsuits. Oh, great Google, show me what swimsuits looked like in 1933. And then had to sort of figure out, okay, what's what was an upper cost swimsuit going to look like? What was something that somebody who was more working class could afford?
Mhm.
Um, although, mostly they made a lot of stuff, but I wanted it to be something kind of store bought. And I found one that I was like, yeah, this looks like something she would probably like. And there was even, I saw there little mermaid, a mermaid was on the tag of the swimsuit. And I was like, okay, I'm going to work that in. And so in that way, I started with the story, and then the research filled in the gaps I had. But then sometimes I start with the research. So, um, thinking about my poem, I have a longer poem, which I will not read the entire poem. Also, it's pretty intense, some of the sections of it. So, the poem Scenes from the Flood, I, s- I guess this kind of starts with a granny story, but not. Um, she told me about when the flood hit in 1937. The Ohio River flooded in 1937. It also flooded again in 1938. So sometimes when you hear people talk about the Ohio River flood, and then they start to, this actually happened between me and a friend of mine, that we were both writing about, oh, the Ohio River flood in the late 30s. And then I was like 37. She's like, no, 38. And
Mm.
and then finally we went back and forth, and finally we looked it up and went, oh, it flooded both years. We're talking about two different floods. Wow. Um, but so she talked about all the trains were stopped, and so she and her sister walked across the Ohio River on one of the railway bridges. They walked from Scioto County to northern Kentucky.
Wow.
Yeah. Um, and I changed the story a little bit, but so I knew the flood was a huge thing for folks in that area, and I knew I wanted to do something with it, but I didn't feel like I had enough from just her story. And so I went and did a whole bunch of research and looked at New York Times articles from that were contemporary to that time, watched a documentary called River Voices that's available on YouTube. That's where some filmmakers by the last name of Lawrence, they are in Scioto County, and they interviewed a bunch of people in the early aughts who had been through the flood. And so I did that. Also the Memford school where my grandmother went, their alumni or somebody runs a wonderful part of their school district's website that's for alumni, and it has old newspaper articles. So I could look
Mm.
up and see what was it like for folks in that area, as opposed to people who were in Portsmouth, which was um, much closer to the river. So Memphis didn't get it as bad. And so I was able to see articles about that. And so Scenes from the Flood really starts from a more research based place. And then I went through an enrhythming process, and then just was like, okay, brain, what do you have? What do you got now? What can you put out there? And so I wanted to read a couple sections from it, if I may.
Oh, definitely.
Um, I'm going to read the first section, which was one of the most fun ones to research, um, because I made up a date that Granny went on, which she had this guy that she did tell me about, who she wasn't really dating. They weren't really a couple, and she'd say there was nothing tricksy going on. Like, okay, Granny, I believe you. I believe you. And but I wanted her to go on some dates with this guy. I wanted her to get to have a moment. And so I got to watch the Don Amici film One in a Million. So I was like, I want to pretend that they went to see this film. So I had to research and see, okay, what could have been playing at the movie theater in Portsmouth during the time that I'm going to write about. And so One in a Million, I think I may have even found something. I know what it was. there were pictures of the movie theater when it was flooded, and you can see the sign, and you could see that 1 in a Million had been playing
Oh,
before all the rain
wow.
started. So I was like, okay, I'm going to watch 1 in a Million and see what I got. And so this is what came out of watching it. And first date, 1 in a Million at the Columbia, January 5th, 1937. Wet, but not too terribly so, the couple that still weren't a couple settled into their seats amid the rustle of coats and newspapers. Waiting sparks catch the electricity between them. Static or desire, who knows? Don Amici plays the part of savior and wise man, witty on the silver screen ahead, while crowds cheer a skating girl fast on the slickness of the ice, knowing she'll come out of her spin, ready to do it again. And
Nice.
thank you. And that was a pleasure to research because I just got to sit down and watch a movie and try to look at it through her eyes. Um, but then there's another section that I think that I pulled most of the images and ideas from that River Voices documentary. So it was completely researched and nothing from any of my family or anybody that I knew personally. And this one's called Heroes in All Sizes, January 27th, 1937. Many people owe their lives to teenage boys who got fancy motorboats for Christmas, or National Guardsmen who said, "If you don't get in this boat, I will shoot you in the leg and carry you down myself." When stubborn men wouldn't leave their homes and their women wouldn't leave them. But how many people owe their lives to little skinny Albert Egbert shimmying through the top floor window of Worcester's Drugs to keep filling prescriptions for people as long as he could, even if he'd never seen them before that very second.
You have given me such a new experience of poetry. I mean, there what you have shown me in your writing is more storytelling to me than any poetry that I've ever read before. I love it.
Thank you. I'm glad that I can help bring people into poetry. And I think one of the things that has helped with that is I studied with Mark Halliday at Ohio University and also David Kirby and Barbara Hamby down here at Florida State. And all of them really focus on clear narratives. Like if Mark was confused about a poem, he would say, "Give me 8 more words or 8 more lines to help me understand this."
Uh,
And from working with them, I really gained the ability to tell a clear narrative in as short an amount of space as I possibly could. And I think that that has blended really well with, I later worked with Annie Finch learning how to write metrical poetry. And so that allows me to write metrical poems that have, hopefully, a nice lyrical bent to them, but are still clear narratives. And it's because I've got those two different things coming from my background that have helped make that work. So I'm glad that folks are enjoying them and that you're enjoying it.
I'm fascinated too by the process that you talked about in rhythming, and how reading a poem in the is the word meter, pacing that you want to have in your own poetry is an intentional practice. And so often I have talked with fiction writers who say, "Oh, I'm writing historical fiction, and while I'm writing, I can't read any other work because I'm always afraid I'm going to sound like that writer." And so this seems to be flipping that idea sort of on its head. And I love that because I think it's important for all writers to read, to immerse themselves in the works of others. Of course, we don't want to mimic or, copy, but I think that there is a lot to be said for really immersing yourself in the works of the writers that you admire. And I know that there's many, many writers in the past who would, they would sit down and handwrite out the novels that they admired, um, in order to kind of get that feel for the pacing and the sentence structure and all of those things. So that's what the enrhythming reminds me of.
Yeah. I think I really think enrhythming works just as well when writing fiction as when writing poetry. I do a Substack where I have writing prompts for folks, and part of the writing prompt is always enrhythming. And every time I'll say, write a poem or a short story or essay, because I really think that it's still, you get those rhythms and you're not getting the line breaks, but you're still can get the rhythms in your mind. And and I think that it's important to choose what you're reading when you're writing, um, for that very reason, that there are sometimes I will pick up a novel, like, Jeff Vandermeer has a new one out, and so he writes, like, a climate science fiction stuff, and I picked it up, and his sentence structures are very distinct, and they're not really something that my writing tends to gravitate towards or that the writing that I do often calls for. And I found myself like I was like, no, 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 let's read something else. Let's get something else in there that's more like what I'm going for, because yeah, your brain is just a sponge and it will take it all in. And I think when people worry about sounding like somebody else, I understand where the worry's coming from, but it's also an unfounded worry, because you will always sound like yourself. No matter what filter you're putting it through, no matter what you're putting in, it will always come through the filter of you.
Mhm.
And so you will always sound like yourself no matter what you're reading, no matter, what you're watching on television or singing, or it's going to always come through the filter of you, and so you will always sound like yourself, but maybe you'll sound like yourself in, a certain tone or a meter. And so that's always fun to play around with and see, what do I think of this version of myself?
Yeah, and I think the playing around with the different versions is very important for writers too. I kind of preach that I think that fiction writers don't practice enough. It's like so many writers that I know think that everything that they write has to be the thing. It has to be whatever they're going to share or whatever they're going to publish, or um, for somebody else to lay their eyes on. They don't give themselves permission to just write as practice and maybe not show it. Maybe write something intentionally to just throw away, but as a practice intentionally.
Oh, that's it. I like that idea. And I wrote a novel, and I've been just it hasn't been going well in terms of getting it to be something that's cohesive, and that others can get with quite yet. And and I wonder, maybe it's my practice novel. Maybe
Mm,
it was I was practicing the ideas of structure and practicing. I was just practicing, and then maybe I'll do something else.
yeah. Well, practice is that's a good lead in to a final question that I have for you, and something that I always like to ask our guests. So, share a little bit about your writing process. Do you have a routine? What does your typical writing day or period of time, if you don't write every day, what does your writing routine look like?
um, I will go through periods where I will write every day,
Mhm.
but those are kind of few and far between. I'm more the kind of person that is like, okay, in the next 3 days, I'm gonna write 15 poems. and then I write 15 poems in 3 days, and then, work on revising them for the next, like, year or whatever. But
Mhm.
one of the things that I do is something that I another thing I picked up from Annie Finch, which is that before I start to write and before I in rhythm, I will kind of get in tune with the energies of the world around me. So that can take the form of just meditating, or I'll do a thing that's called calling the corners. So I just sort of like check in with each direction and like each compass direction and each energy that might be associated with that direction,
Mhm.
and just to be sort of like grounding myself and getting ready. um and then I have this little thing that I will say before I start to write, which is may my may my work be seen by all who feel seen by my work,
Oh.
which is I had been through, because I went through graduate programs, there's a real emphasis on, are you being published in the right places, right? As often, who's publishing your book? Like there's that heavy emphasis on the right being at the right part of the hierarchy. And it almost killed me in many ways, I think. And or at least made me miserable. And so being able to say that I want my work to be seen by all who feel seen by my work is kind of my way of reclaiming like what I really, really want. That it doesn't matter if the journal I'm in is the top tier journal. What matters is, are the people who are going to read this and say, "Ah, is it going to get to those folks?" And so I like to do that before I start to write, and then I'll in rhythm. Um, and one of the things that I've started to do lately, which I don't know why I didn't think about it before, because I'm working on a retelling of Longfellow's poem Evangeline, but it's based on the stories of a friend of mine living in the Panhandle in Wakulla and Leon County in like the 80s and 90s is the primary focus. And it's a long poem. Evangeline is a very long poem, and I've been working on it for like a year and a half, and I'm about halfway done. And I was like, how can I how can I get this done while still trying to get done, like, I tend to do native gardening, but my whole yard we rent, and then there's just tons of invasives, and it's a never-ending battle against the cat's claw and the nandina and things like that, right? And I'm just constantly needing to be out there, and I was finding that I wasn't able to get both done to any satisfactory. And so I made videos of myself reading the portions of Evangeline that I would be writing about next, that I would be mimicking next, and made little videos that were like 10 minutes long of me reading. And then I play them while I'm gardening. And it reminds me to take a break. Every 10 minutes, the video ends, and it's like, okay, time to go write a little bit. And so my video is kind of in rhythming for me. And
Brilliant.
that's been, yeah. And I've gotten so much more done on both of them since I started doing that.
Oh, that's an incredible idea. I love that. Gardening has always been, until the last couple of years, one of the places where I've kind of gone to get myself settled and grounded. And it's a thinking time for me. And I miss that because I haven't been doing much in the last few years. And I love your idea of tying the writing in with the gardening and making the best use of that time in a way that really nourishes both. And thank you for sharing also, about your saying that you use to get yourself grounded, because that is really beautiful. I try to emphasize to um, the writers that I work with that the people who need their work are going to find it, and it's hard sometimes for them to believe in that. And I think that there's a preoccupation oftentimes with that hierarchy that you referred to, and that can kill our creativity. And so your reclamation of your power in using that saying is, I think that's brilliant. Thank you for sharing it.
Thank you. You're welcome, and feel free to use it and share it, and with whoever you think might want to hear it. So
Now, hopefully, the whole world will hear it since we've got you on recording.
yeah, wonderful.
Uh, So, Jennifer, this has been delightful. I'm so glad that we got to spend this time together, and I'm excited to know that you're close here to where I live so that we can get together, hopefully on maybe if not regular, an occasional basis that we can have coffee together or something.
Yes, that would be lovely. It's been wonderful talking to you today.
So is there anything else you want to leave our listeners with, or maybe let them know? You mentioned your Substack, maybe let them know how to find that and remind them about your YouTube channel.
Yeah, excellent. So my Substack and my YouTube both have the same name, which is Meter and Mayhem. So, and the and is an ampersand and on YouTube, but I think that Substack made me actually spell it out. So you can find me under Meter and Mayhem, and my logo is a raccoon reading a book.
Yes, I love
So
it.
yeah. And that was done by a local Tallahassee artist named Diane Thompson. Did I call him Mayhem? His name is Mayhem the raccoon. Um, and then I did another podcast called Granny Love, which is also available on the Meter and Mayhem channel. That is Appalachian folks reading poems about their grandmothers. And so I had Diane do what would Mayhem's granny look like? And she took a picture of my granny and
Oh,
then was like, okay, how would she look like as a raccoon? And so we have that little logo for that one too. So folks can
that's terrific.
find it there.
That's great. That's great. Well, thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate you being here. It's been wonderful spending time with you. And listeners, thank you for joining us today. And stay tuned next time for another podcast from Melody, Kimbu, and I. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us around the writer's table. Please feel free to suggest a topic or a guest by emailing info@aroundthewriterstable.com. Music provided with gracious permission by Langtree. A link to their music is on our homepage at aroundthewriterstable.com. Everyone here around the writer's table wishes you joy in your writing and everyday grace in your living. Take care until next time.